Our friendly neighborhood acolyte who shines brilliantly on the battlefield is up for her first banner ever, and it's safe to say Phoebe has everything she needs to succeed in version 2.1, with two unique playstyles built into her kit that offer main DPS and sub-DPS potential. As a spectral, multi-damage focused character that heavily synergizes with Spectral Frazzle, many players looking to interact with the new debuffs added in 2.0 will get a ton of mileage out of her kit. While her team options may seem a little bit limited in the present, she has an incredible amount of potential in the future. With that, welcome to our full-scope, comprehensive guide on Phoebe, the newest addition to the roster that capitalizes on many of the new features added in version 2.0, and I'm here to break down everything when it comes to how she works, what her best equipment will be, and the steps you need to take across her team building and rotations to make the most out of her insane damage or buffing potential. As always, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Phoebe, with her baseline kit, centers around the activation of two unique states to either deal a massive amount of burst damage via Absolution or buff the living hell out of Spectral Frazzle via Confession, and her forte circuit is where it all begins. However, to understand this entire ability, we'll need to start off with her normal attacks. Her baseline basic attack chains up to 3 times, her heavy attack does a simple multi-hit attack, while her mid-air attacks allow her to plunge onto enemies with a tap or ride a distance with a heavy. However, this isn't everything she does with the attack button. Casting Phoebe's resonant skill summons a ring of mirrors around the target, dealing a small amount of damage, time-locking enemies for up to 2 seconds, while additionally giving her the ability to recast the ability and teleport to its center. When Phoebe's basic attacks hit her ring from outside of it, light will refract to all enemies inside as basic attack damage. While inside of the ring, such as directly after recasting her skill, Phoebe gains a buffed version of her basic attacks and dodge counters called Chamuel's Star, which deal much more damage than her baseline attacks at the cost of losing the refracting ability. Moving on to her forte, the bread and butter of her kit, Phoebe has a unique resource called Prayer that regenerates at 5 per second and caps out at 120. And when this circuit is filled, Phoebe can use a held heavy attack to cast Absolution Litany, deal a massive amount of damage, inflict 1 stack of Spectral Frazzle, and enter the Absolution state, or hold down her resident skill to focus more on being a sub-DPS with Utter Confession, additionally inflicting a stack of Frazzle while dealing much less overall damage in exchange for a massive amount of Concerto energy, about 4 times as much as Absolution Litany. Entering either of these states gives Phoebe access to a very powerful heavy attack, Star Flash, that consumes a new resource found on her forte circuit, Divine Voice. However, it isn't immediately available for cast, and to use this ability, Phoebe has to use her basic attacks. When Phoebe completes the 3rd chain in any basic attack or uses any dodge counter, she'll gain access to Star Flash. When used in the Absolution state, the cost of this ability is 15 out of her 60 Divine Voice, meaning it can be cast up to 4 times and gains a massive 256% damage amp if used on a target with at least 1 stack of Spectral Frazzle active on them. When used in the Confession state, the attack will retain its baseline cost of 30 or up to 2 casts, and instead apply 5 stacks of Spectral Frazzle to every enemy hit. When Phoebe runs out of Divine Voice, she won't exit either of her states, and she won't be able to refresh one of her states through another held heavy attacker skill until she's spent all of her Divine Voice. Her Resonance Liberation is another ability that gains some massive alterations depending on her active state. At a baseline, this ability deals a decent amount of damage in a wide AoE, but when used in Absolution, it gains an incredible 255% damage multiplier. That's a lot. While in Confession, on the other hand, the ability instead applies 8 stacks of Spectral Frazzle to all of the enemies hit. Her outro skill is a final ability that gains different effects depending on her state. At a baseline, this ability deals a massive amount of spectral damage to enemies, and in Absolution, that multiplier is increased by 255%. While in Confession, Phoebe instead buffs the active resonator with 10% spectral resistance debuff to nearby targets, a 100% amp to Spectral Frazzle damage, and an increase to the damage interval of Spectral Frazzle every time it inflicts damage. This effect lasts a whopping 30 seconds, or until Phoebe swaps to the Absolution state, and persists through character swaps. Phoebe's intro skill is the simplest part of her kit. It just knocks back nearby targets and deals spectral damage. When factoring in all of Phoebe's abilities, states, and interactions with each other, she has 2 wildly different playstyles that focus on extended field time and massive bursts of damage, or a much faster rotation that focuses on applying as many debuffs to enemies as possible. When playing her as a main DPS, you'll focus on building up Spectral Frazzle stacks on a sub-DPS like Spectral Rover before introing onto her, activating Absolution, and casting her Resident skill and basic attacks to get off all 4 of her enhanced heavy attacks as fast as possible, before all the Spectral Frazzle stacks fall off the targets. Her Liberation comes at the beginning or end of her rotation, depending on your preference. She'll then outro to another member of your team. On the other other hand, if you're playing Phoebe as a sub-DPS, you'll intro onto her with a support, enter the confession state, cast her liberation to stack as many frazzle stacks as possible before activating her resonance skills and basic attacks to fire off 2 enhanced heavy attacks before outro skilling to her main DPS to continue the team's rotation alongside all of the heavy buffs to Spectral Frazzle from her outro skill. When it comes to her inherent skills, her first simply allows her to cast a second mid-air heavy attack to fly on her broomstick even more. Nothing too crazy here. Her second inherent, on the other hand, grants her a 12% spectral damage bonus whenever she enters Absolution or Confession. She'll be in these states permanently, so you never really lose uptime on this bonus. Phoebe's a character with an incredible amount of depth and serves 2 roles across her teams depending on who exactly her teammates are. In the current state of the game, you should focus on her role as a main DPS, as Spectral Rover is far more suited as a sub-DPS instead of a main for her compositions. But we'll hopefully find that her use cases as a sub-DPS will expand more and more into the future and more character releases. When it comes to actually building Phoebe, starting off with her skills, you'll want to prioritize her Forte circuit as it's the primary source of her damage, then either her resonance skill or liberation, as they're the secondary sources of damage in her kit, and her enhanced basic attacks scale with skill level. And then finally, her basic attack. Her basics don't really deal meaningful damage without her resonance skill, but her enhanced dodge counter inside of her resonance skills ring scales with this ability, so it's worth investing in. Her intro skill, like many other characters, shouldn't be leveled past 5 since its scaling is very poor for the weekly boss mats you'll be spending for it. Moving forward with her weapons, Phoebe has an insane number of viable options, ranging from an incredible free-to-play choice to virtually every 5-star rectifier in the game. These are what the overall comparisons are looking like using Cosmic Ripples, the standard 5-star rectifier, as a baseline. Credits to Pridewind. Let's explain these results, starting off with her signature, Luminous Hymn. This weapon grants a 12% attack buff, a massive 36% crit rate, and a 42% damage buff to both basic and heavy attacks as long as an enemy has Spectral Frazzle on them. And Phoebe's kit simply doesn't work at all unless that debuff is applied. It also serves a dual role in her sub-DPS lineups by buffing the damage of Frazzle by an impressive 30%. The next best option is another limited 5-star, only this time it's Yinlin's. With a general 12% attribute damage buff, the same 36% crit rate as her signature, and an effect that Phoebe can easily stack for more attack, Phoebe can front load more of her burst to make use of this buff before it runs out in her rotation. Its incredible base stats are the main contribution here, and with identical stats to her signature, I recommend giving this one a try if you have it before investing in Luminous Hymn. Her third best option is another signature, Judges. With a 12% attack buff and a whopping 72% critical damage, this weapon gives you the ability to reach incredible crit values on Phoebe that her signature won't be capable of, and its stacking buff to basic attacks can be built up partially across her rotations. However, Phoebe won't be able to max it out or use its on-field effect, so it's mainly a stat stick for her kit. The fourth best 5-star option will be the standard one. With a lot of attack, ER, and an easily stackable basic attack buff, it's a solid option that lowers her ER requirements but doesn't have the same critical bonuses as others. When it comes to 4-star options, there's one standout choice: the new free-to-play event weapon, Ocean's Gift. With a ramping spectral damage buff that scales to 40% and an incredible base attack, this weapon is the go-to pick to maximize Phoebe's damage potential if you don't have 5-star options. It's also completely free. When it comes to other choices, you'll have Augment, the BP weapon, due to its general attack buff and built-in crit, as well as the Renacita craftable, Waltz and Masquerade. Phoebe will be able to fully stack up this effect as Spectral Frazzle is a debuff, but you'll find better performance at a much lower cost with the event weapon. I don't recommend investing in any other 4-star option given the incredible array of choices Phoebe already has, so you should just save materials until you get either of them. Now it's time to move on to her echoes, and Phoebe has 3 options to choose from: 2 as a main DPS and 1 as a sub-DPS. For a main DPS, you'll have the Eternal Radiance or Celestial Light sets. Eternal Radiance is the go-to given its absurd 20% buff to crit rate and 25% buff to spectral damage at full stacks. However, Celestial Light with the Morning Ikes is still a competitive choice given that it provides 15% more spectral damage at the cost of no crit rate and no need for buildup. I'd always recommend Eternal Radiance though, due to the huge leeway it gives across your Echo substats. On the other hand, if you're building Phoebe as a sub-DPS, Moonlit Clouds is your only real choice, as it'll work perfectly with her buffing outro skill and Confession to maximize your main DPS damage. For her Echo main stats, they'll be the same across all of her sets, with a crit 4 cost, 2 spectral damage 3 costs, and 2 attack 1 costs. For the substats, she'll have nearly identical requirements across all 3 sets, prioritizing as much critical damage, rate, ER, attack, and heavy, basic, and resonance liberation damage stats as possible, aiming for around 1900 attack, at least 60 to 75% critical rate, over 270% critical damage, and 120% ER for smooth uptime on her liberation. If you're playing her as a sub-DPS, you might want a bit more ER, which shouldn't be too difficult with the Moonlit set's 2-piece bonus. Phoebe uses basically every damage bonus in her kit aside from resonance skills, so don't worry too much about which rolls you're getting. The last area of investment when it comes to Phoebe involves your wallet or a lot of saved astrite, her sequence nodes. Big thanks to Pridewind for calculating the damage increase per node. Her first node is an insane damage buff to her liberation, increasing the absolution damage multiplier to 480% from 255, while also increasing the damage multiplier of the confession cast by 90% and fully maximizing all spectral frazzle stacks on targets hit. Her second node additionally buffs her outro skill, granting a massive 120% damage amp to frazzle targets in absolution, while in confession state it adds 120% additional damage amp to spectral frazzle during her outro skill's buff, totaling up to 220%. Her third node adds more damage to her enhanced heavy attack, granting a 91% damage multiplier to her absolution cast and a whopping 249% to her confession cast. Her fourth node applies a 10% spectral resistance debuff to any target hit by her basic attack, enhanced basic, or dodge counters. And her fifth node grants her a rather unimpressive 12% spectral damage buff upon casting her intro skill, easily her worst upgrade. And her sixth node, the big one, heavily buffs her resonance skill. She applies a much longer time lock effect upon using a Ring of Mirrors, and if casting this ability in Absolution or Confession, she'll gain a 10% attack buff and immediately trigger an enhanced heavy attack that consumes no Divine Voice and isn't considered a heavy attack. Now that we've covered Phoebe's build, let's get into some of her teams and optimal rotations. Unfortunately, at this point in Wuthering Waves' life cycle, Phoebe has a very limited selection of teammates as she's tied to Spectral Rover in virtually all of her compositions due to the latter's ability to apply and extend the duration of Frazzle. However, Spectral Rover can take on the role of a sub-DPS with Moonlit Clouds, a support with Rejuvenating Glow, or a main DPS with the Eternal Radiance set, giving her an interesting number of potential team comps. When playing Phoebe with a Sub-DPS Rover and a support, you'll simply build up Concerto on your support while swapping to Rover to use their heavy attack, Liberation, and Forte enhanced skill to apply 8 stacks of Frazzle and the Shimmer debuff to extend its duration. You'll then top off Concerto on your support, intro onto Rover, use another enhanced resonance skill, and then top off their Concerto along with an Echo skill before swapping onto Phoebe to perform her full rotation in Absolution. You want to rotate as fast as possible on Spectral Rover to maintain as many stacks of Frazzle as possible, so you'll want to weave in Rover's build-up closer to the end of your support's rotation to maximize this debuff's uptime. However, this isn't the only way to play Phoebe as a main DPS. For a different style of play that uses a sub-DPS like Mortefi or Sanhua, you'll instead run Spectral Rover on Rejuvenating Glow to fill the support role on your team. Don't worry, as long as you have Rover's S5, they will heal upon casting their Liberation. You'll start off this team's rotation by building up Concerto on your sub-DPS before swapping onto Rover to fill up their Concerto with heavy attacks and resonance skill casts. You'll want to top off Rover's Concerto with their Liberation and Forte enhanced skill before immediately outroing onto your sub-DPS, who should have close to a filled Concerto bar, topping theirs off before Echo skilling immediately onto Phoebe. If you time this fast enough, Phoebe should still have plenty of Frazzle stacks to work with across her rotation to maximize the damage in her Absolution state alongside the outro buff of a sub-DPS. If you plan on using Rover like this, I highly recommend using a Concerto energy weapon like Overture on them to speed up their rotations. If you're playing Phoebe as a sub-DPS, you'll want to start off the rotation building up Concerto on your support before swapping onto Phoebe, holding her resonance skill to enter Confession before using her Liberation, resonance skill, and basic attack combos to enable her enhanced heavy attacks, filling up her Concerto bar before using an Echo skill and swapping off to her main DPS. This isn't a recommended playstyle for her since Spectral Rover really isn't that great of a damage dealer. However, Phoebe's Frazzle stacks will persist throughout any DPS's rotation even if they can't apply Frazzle themselves, so you can experiment around to see if this playstyle works for you. Now that we've covered Phoebe's team rotations, it's time to talk about Phoebe's, and thankfully she's pretty simple to pick up. When Phoebe enters the field via intro skill, you'll immediately trigger one of her 2 states, cast her resonance skill, and then fire off 3 basic attacks and an enhanced heavy attack as many times as possible, weaving in dodge counters as well if you're close to getting hit, 2 times in her confession state and 4 times in Absolution. You'll then cap off her rotation by using her resonance liberation before swapping off the field. You can use the Nightmare Morning Ice's Echo skill at any point in your rotation as long as the enemy still has Spectral Frazzle stacks on them. You can choose to cast her Liberation earlier in her rotation if you'd like, but keep in mind that her Liberation doesn't need Frazzle stacks active to gain its huge buff in Absolution state, and it applies 8 out of 10 Frazzle stacks in the Confession state. It's also important to keep in mind that Phoebe, when paired with Rover as a sub-DPS, can freely quick swap across her rotation since there isn't an outro buff for her to lose, so feel free to get creative across her gameplay. At the end of the day, Phoebe is one of the most versatile and unique characters in the game, one of the first who can openly take on a variety of different roles across her teams, with a big weakness in how tailored her team comps have to be to make use of her spectral frazzle fueled effects. There aren't very many characters you can directly compare to her, given how she deals a variety of different damage types across her rotation, and Jinhsi is the closest comparison simply from attribute, with none of her sub-DPS capabilities. She's relatively easy to use on the battlefield, is easy to manage on the echo side, but unfortunately has a very limited number of team comps at this point in the game. However, her value as a character can only grow as time goes on and more frazzle characters get introduced to the roster. She can carry teams on her back as a main DPS and also has immense buffing potential that hasn't been realized yet. She's easily one of the best pulls in the game, but you might not find a huge amount of value in her if you've already got a spectral damage dealer on your roster. And, well, Jinhsi reran in the version prior. But if you really love the MC, you'll love playing them their spectral version. You can't really go wrong with Phoebe since they're basically glued to her in all of her team comps. As always, if you enjoyed this content, please hit that like and subscribe button. Peace out.